restaurant, or just over $300,000 today. Confident of their future, Showbiz Pizza was also spending quite a bit of money on R&D, with the majority of funds going towards even more advanced second-generation animatronics. One of these was Uncle Clunk, who is capable of 32 different movements and was to be a major addition to the stage shows. There was also a far more advanced Mitzi Mozzarella in the works, as well as a second-generation Duke, who would have played the drums with far more realism, with the ultimate goal to update all of the characters by the 1990s. However, at the same time as Showbiz Pizza, their competition was also going through quite a few changes of their own.
Smile America, say Chuck E. Cheese. Smile America, say Chuck E. Cheese. Food and games and all kinds of creatures. For a taste of pizza time theater. Smile America, say Chuck E. Cheese.
Much like Showbiz, new locations were popping up all across the US, and along with the addition of new attractions and video games, major updates were also made to the animatronics and stage shows. For starters, the original portrait-style presentation was completely abandoned and replaced with a far more impressive balcony variation. These newer animatronics were known as Cyberamics, and were meant to give the ones over at Showbiz Pizza a true run for their money. These more complex animated figures performed on balconies and featured a new set of comedy routines and song covers, although the basic concept was still the same. Many locations also saw the addition of new characters for the cabaret room, such as Artie Antlers, who was originally called Elkton John, and BB Bubbles. But don't worry, Dolly Dimples and her bouncing bosom was left in a handful of the restaurants, which no doubt led to some poor child to grow up with a strange and unexplainable hippo fetish. There were also new pun-centric sideshows such as the Beagles, who performed songs by the Beatles, and the Beach Bowsers, who played songs by the Beach Boys. Yet another addition was the King, a 9-foot-tall animatronic lion who sang Elvis Presley covers. In a select few locations, there was even a Michael Jackson variation, and at one point was known as Michael Katzen. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't briefly mention Cheesy Street, otherwise known as the Cheese Factory. It had a Disneyland-inspired facade, and inside was basically a funhouse. However, this was a bit of an unintentional nightmare for kids, as many wound up getting lost in the maze, which led to an urban legend of disappearing children. Another unintentionally horrific adventure was Mr. Munch's Magic Madhouse, which could be found quite literally under the balcony stage. Inside was also a maze, but supposedly contained panic-inducing strobe lighting, and was eventually closed due to, quote, poor conditions inside the tunnels. Now, if all these new additions seem a bit all over the place, you're not crazy, as this was done to make each restaurant unique, which also enticed patrons to visit different locations within the same city or state. So yeah, both Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza saw tremendous growth in the early 80s, and both expected to have over 1,000 locations before the end of the decade. But while the battle of the animatronic-centric pizza parlors was mainly between these two monolithic franchises, their rising popularity led to a slew of copycat locations.
Dining out is one of the fastest growing leisure activities of the 1980s, and I think we're getting a more and more sophisticated audience that expects good food, but they want to be entertained. And we want to entertain them and give them a place that's fun to come to, where they can spend the entire evening.
Just to name a few examples, there was Bullwinkle's Family Food and Fun, PJ Pizzazz's Family Fun, John Philip Tuba's, Sergeant Singer's Pizza Circus, and Gadget's Restaurant, featuring Sammy Sands and the Looney Tunes stage show. But wait, I'm not done. There was also the Magic Pizza, Fuzzy Wuzzy Wizard's Wonderland of Food and Fantasy, Razzmatazz Pizza Palace, Major Magic's All-Star Pizza Review, Fairplay Pizza Theater, Tex Critter's Pizza Jamboree, The Pizza Planet next to Denim World, Giggleby's Robots Pizza and Games, Mark Twain's Riverboat Playhouse, Captain Andy's River Town, Captain's Carnival, Circus Playhouse Restaurant, Circus World Pizza Restaurant, Grand Prix Pizza Cabaret, Juster's Courtyard Playland, The Enchanted Castle, The Celebration Station, and last but not least, Dimes and Critters Pizza. So yeah, to say it was a fad is a bit of an understatement.
By the way, the entertainment by the Critter Band is free. So come to Dimes and Critters in the 5 Mile Shopping Center for a great value and a great time.
Now, it's important to mention that in 1982, the lawsuit between Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza finally came to a conclusion. Ultimately, the case was settled out of court, in which Showbiz Pizza agreed to pay close to $1 million in damages, as well as a percentage of their profits for the next 14 years. So for a time it seemed Pizza Time Theater came out ahead as the victor, but severe financial trouble was brewing for the company behind the scenes. You see, during Chuck E. Cheese's aggressive expansion, franchisees were allowed to go virtually unchecked with their spending and promotional campaign expenses. Another issue were the labor costs for upkeeping the animatronic shows, as they built up with each new location and were vastly underestimated. But more importantly, the appeal and novelty of these stage show-centric pizza parlors simply began to wear off, and the also aggressively expanding Showbiz Pizza Place only saturated the market even further. To put it simply, the opening of new locations was outpacing the need for new locations, too much supply and not nearly enough demand. These financial troubles were coming to a head in 1983, and they might have recovered if it hadn't also been the same year as the video game market crash. Now, it's a bit of an oversimplification of a complex topic, but for our purposes, the oversaturation of video game consoles led to a decline in video game arcade attendance, which was one of Chuck E. Cheese's major selling points. Another detriment was Atari's financial loss of $500 million, which all but destroyed the company, as keep in mind, they were the biggest supplier of video games to Pizza Time Theater. However, the Achilles heel of their downfall was Nolan Bushnell himself, as he'd invested much of the pizza profits into new ventures within the video game and tech industry. So when Chuck E. Cheese began hemorrhaging a combined total of $20 million every month, there was no cash to bail them out. This led to the resignation of founder Nolan Bushnell, and that March, Pizza Time Theater filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But Showbiz Pizza was also suffering from many, if not all, the same problems as Chuck E. Cheese, as their once exponential growth just a few years earlier had also come to a screeching halt. The decline in business had also abruptly stopped the flow of money into R&D, with the second-generation, more advanced Showbiz animatronics cancelled midway in development. The only one to escape this fate was the terrifying, lovable Uncle Clonk, who actually did wind up debuting in a handful of locations. Unfortunately, this well-intentioned nightmare fuel wasn't all that well received, and this led to a ton of Uncle Clonks going unsold and unused. But Uncle Clonk wasn't the only victim, as Showbiz Pizza's abrupt expansion cancellation led to a massive surplus of Rockafire animatronics at creative engineering with nowhere to go.
He's the funniest robot science ever made.
Hello, you're on the air with Uncle Clunk. Oh, I get it. You're doing your impression of a telephone ringing. What are you, some kind of nut? I'd say you were more some kind of fruit, actually.
Now, despite the decline of both pizza parlors, due to the lawsuit, Showbiz Pizza was the one still making payouts to Chuck E. Cheese. So in order to save the company, Showbiz Pizza set out to purchase the now bankrupt Chuck E. Cheese and absorb all their assets. The merger led to Showbiz Pizza and Pizza Time Theaters to unify as a single entity, which in 1985 became Showbiz Pizza Time Inc. It's also worth mentioning that, similar to Nolan Bushnell, Bob Brock wound up stepping down from his position as president and CEO of Showbiz Pizza. As far as the restaurants themselves, they were more or less kept independent from each other, except when it came to the marketing, as Billy Bob and Chuck E. Cheese were now seen as pals and part of the same bizarre pizza parlor animal universe. Both franchises were also rebranded with new logos and simplified titles, now sharing the same color scheme and word font. Going even further, all the commercials and TV spots for both restaurants were made to be almost identical and interchangeable.
But at Showbiz Pizza you can act like a kid, you can have more fun than you ever did. But at Chuck E. Cheese you can act like a kid, you can have more fun than you ever did. You can giggle, you can wiggle, you can flip your lid. Chuck E. Cheese, where a kid can be a kid. You can giggle, you can wiggle, you can flip your lid. Showbiz Pizza, where a kid can be a kid.
Now, for a time, it did seem like both pizza parlors would be spared from complete obscurity, but it wasn't long after the merger that Chuck E. Cheese began getting the spotlight over Showbiz Pizza. A major factor behind this favoritism was due to an unforeseen ramification of the acquisition. Showbiz Pizza no longer had exclusive rights to the Rockafire explosion. This meant Aaron Fechter's company could now license the popular stage show to other businesses. It also meant they could develop and sell variations of the show, with one example being the Moonrockers, which were essentially the same band but with cosmetic and show tape alterations. Showbiz Pizza did continue to keep the Rockafire explosion units in the restaurants, but they soon began making changes to the presentation to make it a bit more unique to the pizza parlor. One of the most intriguing was the Yogi Bear show, and while footage of it has yet to surface, there's evidence that it was in at least a handful of locations. Another variation was known as the Magic Stage, although precisely which location or locations tested this retheming is unknown. As far as the terrifying Uncle Clunk, he became Orwell, a robot you control, and while certainly educational for budding engineers, this somehow made the animatronic even more horrific. But Showbiz Pizza wasn't alone in major changes, as the merger also affected many aspects of Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time theater. Alongside Showbiz, the food quality was improved, as well as featuring a new selection of non-video game-based arcade games. As far as changes to the main form of entertainment, a select few locations saw the addition of the incredibly bizarre Family Album stage show. Equally as strange was another variation called the Hot Fudge Show, but evidently these were both placeholders while developing new Chuck E. Cheese animatronics. Soon the majority of locations were unified with a brand new show called Chucky's House, which was basically a more advanced version of the balcony stage show. It also incorporated live performances alongside the animatronics, with the usual assortment of show tunes and popular song covers. The combination of updates and alterations to both pizza parlors led to a moderate sales increase across all locations, and their prospects began to look far more optimistic. But things would soon take a turn for the worse. Or better, depending on which characters and restaurant you were a bigger fan of. You see, as a way to gain back the exclusivity of the Rock-afire explosion, the new owners of Showbiz Pizza were putting major pressure on Aaron Fechter to hand over the copyrights. But after he repeatedly refused, the decision was made to get rid of them entirely in favor of a new show, Mr. Munch's Make-Believe Band.
Next will be Billy Bob. First his overalls, then mask, body fur, hands, left foot and foam ankles, and then his right foot, which will need to be unbolted.
The drastic initiative was known as Concept Unification and spanned across all Showbiz Pizza restaurants, in which the beloved Rock-afire explosion characters were skinned of all their aesthetics down to their bones. Or mechanics. These same animatronic characters were then given new cosmetics and costumes based on the Chuck E. Cheese characters, and though I realize these are simply inanimate objects, there's something incredibly unsettling about this process. So just like that, practically overnight, Mr. Munch's Make-Believe Band was the new face of Showbiz Pizza. And by new face, I mean the disembodied corpses of the Rock-afire explosion. What's really interesting is that thanks to internal documents made public by ShowbizPizza.com, it turns out they initially toyed around with a brand new show featuring a completely new set of characters. And speaking of ShowbizPizza.com, for even more history on these pizza parlors, definitely check out the site once you finish the episode. It's been a truly invaluable source for information, photographs and archival footage, and the documentation of the two franchises is nothing short of astounding. Anyway, Concept Unification meant Billy Bob and his pals were erased from existence within the restaurants in every possible way, with only the name of the restaurant being left intact. But the final nail in the coffin for Showbiz Pizza came in 1992, as every single location officially became Chuck E. Cheese restaurants, and the name Showbiz Pizza was officially retired.
Why go to a boring restaurant when you can go to Chuck E.'s? Next time Mom says, let's eat out. Remember, Chuck E. Cheese, please. The restaurant where a kid can be a kid.
All through the 90s and early 2000s, Chuck E. Cheese continued to dramatically expand, not to mention evolve with the times. Most of these efforts were done as a way to keep the Big Cheese himself hip, trendy, and cool for a new generation of kids. But as far as the animatronic entertainment, these soon began taking steps backward in quality. You see, when it came time to update the stage shows, initially they began testing an elaborate successor, the Chuck E. Cheese Awesome Adventure Machine. However, this was seen as too costly to operate, so a simplified and scaled back version known as Studio C was installed in the vast majority of locations. But over the years, the robotics were scaled back even further, and the updated figures for Mr. Munch's Make-Believe Band were a true example of this. So it should come as no surprise that in 2017, the process of phasing them out entirely officially began, and continues to this day. By 2019, Chuck E. Cheese was valued at a whopping $1.4 billion, with close to 600 locations. However, the COVID-19 pandemic took a huge toll on the pizza place, and the company was ultimately forced to file for bankruptcy, again, in June of 2020.
This show that you see behind me has been in existence for about 12 years, and even though it's still running really well and gets a lot of good reviews, there's a lot of new technology that's been developed since then. We've had a lot of new ideas since then. So we just wanted to update it and have a new show that would take us into the 21st century.
As far as Chuck E. Cheese's original rival, after Concept Unification, Aaron Fechter's company never really recovered. production on new Rockafire explosion units came to a near screeching halt, leading to hundreds of employees to be let go from the once booming headquarters. But that's not to say it was the end of Fechter's animatronic creations, as he would go on to produce a number of variations to the Rockafire explosion. Unfortunately, they never seemed to take a hold of the public the same way as the original. One of the final nails in the coffin for creative engineering was the anti-gravity freedom machine, which was basically an email device before there was email. However, right around the time the product was released, the internet boom officially began, and email came with it, without the need for an expensive and specific machine to do it from. So he was ultimately forced to lay off the last remaining of his once 300+ employees.
And then there's email.
Email? I heard that's really neat. My cousin has a pen pal in Sweden and they write back and forth and it transmits right away and doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, you can even talk with people all over the world on chat lines.
Over the years, many attempts have been made to resurrect the Rockafire explosion, as well as Showbiz Pizza as a standalone location. From restaurants like Rockafire Pizza, Billy Bob's Wonderland, Showbiz Pizza Zone, Looney Birds, or even the Rockafire Bar. However, with the exception of Billy Bob's Wonderland, all these locations eventually had to close their doors. As far as the present, Aaron Fechter still works to preserve both creative engineering and his mechanical creations, and for a price you can even tour the now mostly abandoned headquarters. Although he is still working on that second-generation Duke, so who knows what the future holds. Robert Brock, or Bob Brock, passed away of cancer in 1998, while Nolan Bushnell continues to contribute to the ever-changing world of technology. As far as the Rockafire explosion itself, there's no question that their legacy, and those who are a part of it, continue to live on. The most notable example by far is the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, which used a combination of the Showbiz Pizza animatronics and Chuck E. Cheese as a clear and obvious source of inspiration. But let's be honest, even without the horror settings of a video game, the animatronics themselves continue to be a source of a ton of unintentional nightmare fuel, at least the ones in various states of disrepair. So at the end of the day, while both of the original Pizza Parlor animatronic spectaculars are a distant memory, enough of what made them so unique still exists today to ensure they'll never be forgotten.